It was supposed to protect us. Tariffs, tax breaks, laws with names that sounded like strength, like bringing America back. But by 2025, something else happened. The factories went quiet. The contracts disappeared. And the headlines? They weren't from Washington. They were from Ontario. No missiles, no sanctions. Just a mining law, passed by a neighbor we thought we outranked. And with it, $38 billion in electric vehicle deals vanished. Not to China, but to Canada. While we were still writing policies, they were shipping batteries to Europe. This wasn't a trade war. It wasn't even retaliation. It was something colder, smarter, more permanent. They didn't outvote us. They outbuilt us, and in doing so, they exposed the truth behind our so-called protection. We weren't protected. We were paused, while the world moved on. But that was just the beginning. The machines didn't stop with a bang. They just didn't start again. In Michigan, workers showed up to empty lots. In Indiana, hiring was frozen before it began. It wasn't China. It wasn't sabotage. It was a single piece of legislation from Canada. Bill 142. On paper, it looked like a local mining reform, but in practice, it rewrote the global rules of the EV supply chain. From now on, if you wanted Canadian lithium, you had to mine, refine, and build inside Canada before exporting. No more shipping raw materials to Ohio or Kentucky for finishing. And while U.S. companies were still waiting on permits, Canadian firms were already shipping batteries straight to Europe. Overnight, $38 billion in electric vehicle contracts shifted north. Ford lost deals. GM paused expansion. Panasonic rerouted investments. And the U.S.? It watched. Because by the time policymakers reacted, the contracts were already signed, and the jobs were already gone. This wasn't some hostile takeover. It was a cold, quiet rerouting of power, built not on missiles, but on paperwork. They didn't outproduce us. They outmaneuvered us. And America, the birthplace of the modern car, suddenly found itself locked out of the next automotive revolution. But the next front hit much closer to home. It didn't make the front page. No headlines, no sound bites. Just a quiet surge in the numbers. On your utility bill. In early 2025, residents in upstate New York opened envelopes that left them stunned. A 23% increase in electricity costs, with no storm, no disaster, no explanation. But there was one: Canada. For decades, northern states relied on a steady stream of Canadian hydroelectricity, cheap, stable, and unnoticed. Until it wasn't. After a pricing dispute over transmission costs and cross-border credits, Canadian utilities pulled back on exports. And when they resumed, the rates weren't the same. Minnesota, Michigan, and parts of Vermont saw bills jump as much as 25%. One analyst called it an invisible tariff, not passed by Congress, not debated on cable news, just imposed. And you felt it. Not at the polls, but in your pocket. This wasn't a trade war. It was a grid shift. A neighbor became a leverage point. And the U.S. discovered the hard way. You don't have to lose a factory to lose control. Sometimes, you just have to lose the current. But what happened next hit even deeper, right at the dinner table. The harvest was ready. The workers weren't. In Nebraska, rows of corn browned under the sun, not from drought, but from delay. Trucks didn't show. Diesel costs spiked, and the labor never arrived. Across the Midwest, it was the same story. Too few hands, too many acres. By the time help came, it was too late. Meanwhile, just across the border, Canada was setting export records, not just in wheat, but in fresh produce and packaged goods. Their secret? Simple. Trade routes to Europe through the Atlantic, subsidized transport, and labor from bilateral agreements the U.S. never signed. So while American farmers waited, Canadian grain sailed. In 2025, the U.S. didn't run out of food. It ran out of movement. What used to be called the world's breadbasket became a bystander to the dinner tables of other nations. And the ones who stayed, the farmers who didn't quit, felt abandoned by a system that left their crops rotting and their costs rising. "We didn't quit farming. Farming quit us." You won't see that quote on a trade balance sheet, but you'll feel it in the extra $60 at checkout, in the emptier shelves in the off-season, in the quiet anger of people feeding a country that no longer feels like it feeds them back. But even as the fields sat still, another storm was brewing, not in the heartland, but in the hard drives. The headline still said Silicon Valley, but the money, said Toronto. In early 2025, something shifted. Apple didn't hold a press conference. They just opened their new AI model training facility in Ontario. Microsoft quietly expanded a multi-billion-dollar compute center, not in Seattle, but outside Ottawa. And in the shadows of those server racks, thousands of American engineers holding Canadian work visas. Visa approvals surged. Housing near tech zones spiked. Toronto became the top destination for AI infrastructure, surpassing San Francisco for the first time. This wasn't a brain drain. It was a vote of confidence. Canada didn't invent transformer models. They didn't lead the LLM race. But they offered one thing American firms were desperate for: certainty. Faster approvals, longer funding timelines, and no policy whiplash between elections. One investor put it bluntly: "You can't innovate with one foot in a shutdown." The U.S. was still debating Section 230, AI safety boards, and compute export limits. Canada, they were already printing inference credits. And just like that, the birthplace of the digital revolution started looking outsourced. Not to China, but to a country we thought was just our test market. But all revolutions eventually come home, and that's where the final blow landed. There was no siren, no breaking news banner, just fewer ships and more empty cranes. At the port of Long Beach, container traffic dropped 11% in just 6 months. Some blamed inflation. Others pointed to seasonal shifts. But the real story? It was 3,500 kilometers north, in Halifax. Canada's eastern port posted a 19% surge in cold chain shipments to Europe. Powered by quiet investment, faster customs, and new CPKC rail lines that didn't touch Chicago. The trade routes changed. The ships kept moving. They just stopped landing here. CPKC, the newly merged Canadian Pacific Kansas City Rail, connected Mexico to Canada without relying on U.S. bottlenecks. $22.5 billion in U.S. port revenue disappeared. 27,000 jobs gone. And still, no press conference. No headlines. Just silence. Trade didn't collapse. It rerouted. And by the time anyone noticed, the flags on the containers had changed. This wasn't an invasion. This wasn't a crisis. It was a quiet reprogramming of global flow. You don't lose a country overnight. You lose it in invoices, in shipping logs, in jobs that don't come back, and ports that fall quiet. And that's when it hit. We weren't being replaced. We were being skipped. But the real reckoning wasn't at the docks. It was in what we still refuse to ask. It wasn't a single moment. There was no collapse, just a quiet surrender. Energy flowed north. Food crossed borders. Tech talent followed trust. Ships changed course. And through it all, we kept saying, "We're still the leaders. We still make the rules." But leadership isn't declared. It's noticed. And lately, fewer countries are noticing. The American dream didn't end with a bang. It expired in a spreadsheet, in a missing shipment, in a port that fell silent. This wasn't about being overtaken. It was about being overlooked, one decision at a time, one shortcut, one missed investment, until the world looked up and saw someone else. And maybe that's the deepest loss of all. Not that we were defeated, but that we stopped showing up We taught the world to trade, to build, to believe in scale, speed, and ambition. And when the world finally listened, we forgot to keep listening ourselves. So now the question isn't, who took our place? It's, did we even notice we left?